My son changed the locks on a Sunday morning. I know it was Sunday because I had just come back from the early service at Mount Zion Baptist, the same church where I had carried his mother's casket 7 years ago. I was still wearing my good shoes, the ones with the worn left heel she always said I needed to replace. I had a brown paper bag in my arm with a carton of eggs and a loaf of bread, because I had planned to make him breakfast, the way I used to when he was small. The key did not turn. I stood on the porch of the house I had built with my own 2 hands and tried the key 3 more times, slow and patient, the way you do when you are not yet ready to believe what is already true. There was a white envelope tucked under the new doorknob. My name was on the outside, in my daughter-in-law's handwriting. I recognized it immediately. She had very precise, very deliberate cursive, the kind that looked elegant until you understood it was designed to look that way. I set the egg carton down on the porch railing and opened the envelope. I will not recite every word she wrote. Some words do not deserve to be repeated. The summary is this. She wrote that I had become a burden. She wrote that my presence in the home I owned was an obstacle to their future. She wrote that a room had been arranged for me at a facility called Sunrise Gardens on Poplar Avenue and that a car would come for me at noon. She wrote, at the very bottom, in a sentence that was underlined twice with enough force that the pen had nearly torn through the paper, that a man who spent 40 years pulling wire through walls and crawl spaces had nothing to offer anyone anymore, and that the most dignified thing I could do for my son was disappear quietly. That sentence. I folded the letter and put it in my breast pocket. I did not feel rage. Not yet. What I felt was something closer to the moment right before a circuit trips. That held breath. That instant of stillness before everything goes dark. I picked up the egg carton. I walked back to my truck. I sat behind the wheel for a long time and looked at the porch I had poured, the columns I had set, the porch light. I had wired myself on a hot July afternoon 32 years ago, with my wife handing me tools through the window, and my son, maybe 4 years old, sitting on the steps eating a popsicle and watching me work. I started the truck and drove. Because here is what my daughter-in-law did not know, what my son had apparently forgotten or never understood, what I had taken deliberate, careful steps to ensure no one in my family would ever think to investigate, the electrical contracting company I had founded, out of a second-hand van and a set of tools I bought at an estate sale in 1987, was not the small regional outfit they imagined. It had not stayed small. I had not stayed small. I had grown it quietly. Methodically, the way you grow anything that matters, without announcement, without celebrating too early, one job at a time, one contract at a time, one reinvested dollar at a time, until it became something that large commercial developers called when they needed the work done right. My son, who had joined the company as a project manager a decade ago and risen to executive vice president, believed he worked for a Houston-based construction group that had acquired us years back. He believed the founder, a man known in company correspondence only through the law offices of my attorney, was some distant financial entity with no face and no presence. He believed he was the most important person in that building. He had no idea he was eating lunch in his father's house. There is a man I have known since we were both 18 years old throwing newsprint off the same truck on the same Memphis route. His name does not matter here. What matters is that he became a lawyer, one of the sharpest and most quietly feared corporate attorneys in the Mid-South, and that he was the only person alive who knew the full architecture of what I had built. I had called him from the truck before I had even reached the end of my own street. He picked up on the second ring. He always picks up on the second ring. I said, "They changed the locks." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Where are you?" "Driving," I said. "Come here," he said. And then, after a pause, the kind of pause that carries 45 years of friendship in it, he said, "I have to show you something, brother. I was going to call you this week. I think you need to see it before we decide what to do." I drove to his office on Madison Avenue. The building is modest from the outside. That is intentional. He has always said that people who advertise their power in their architecture are people who are not confident in what they actually have. Inside, it is different. His assistant showed me to the conference room. My old friend was already there, standing at the window with his jacket off and his sleeves rolled, which is how I know something serious is happening. He had a thick manila folder on the table and a legal pad covered in his small, cramped handwriting. He did not ask me if I wanted coffee. He sat down and opened the folder and said, "6 months ago, you asked me to run a routine audit on the company's vendor accounts because something in the quarterly numbers felt wrong to you. Do you remember?" I remembered. I had mentioned it to him casually, the way you mention a loose wire to another electrician. Something in the expenditure reports for the Gulf Coast Division had not added up in a way I could put my finger on but could not dismiss. I had asked him to have someone look. I had not heard back and had not followed up. I assumed it was nothing. It was not nothing. He turned the folder toward me. I looked at the documents. Invoices. Dozens of them. A vendor called Meridian Supply Solutions, LLC, billed to the company for materials and logistics services over a period of 22 months. The totals were not small. He had a forensic accountant run the numbers. The total across all fraudulent invoices was close to $3 million. $3 million siphoned out of the company I had built from a second-hand van through a shell company that did not exist, had never provided a single bolt or a single service, and had been created 8 months before the first invoice appeared in the system. I looked at the name on the LLC registration. I looked at my old friend. He nodded before I could say anything. His eyes were not angry. They were the eyes of a man who has seen the worst of human nature professionally for 4 decades and has learned to absorb it without flinching, but not without grief. "My daughter-in-law," I said. Her name was on the registration as sole member. "Yes," he said. "And my son," I said. "He oversees every vendor approval in the Gulf Coast Division. Nothing gets signed without him." He let me sit with that for a moment. Then he said, "The forensic accountant believes the approvals were deliberate. The invoices were structured specifically to stay beneath the single transaction reporting threshold. Someone understood how the approval system worked from the inside." I leaned back in my chair. The fluorescent light above me hummed. I have always noticed the hum of fluorescent lights. It is an occupational habit I have never been able to unlearn. I noticed it now because it was the only sound in the room, and my brain was doing what it does when it is trying to process something it does not want to accept, which is to fixate on something neutral and mechanical. "My son knew," I said. It was not a question. He knew, my old friend confirmed. And there is more. He reached into the folder and pulled out a second document. This one was a petition filed in Shelby County Probate Court 11 days ago. Application for emergency guardianship of a named individual on grounds of demonstrated cognitive decline, impaired judgment, and inability to manage personal affairs. The named individual was me. The petition was supported by a sworn affidavit from a physician I had never seen or heard of, attesting to a diagnosis he had never made because I had never been his patient. It was supported by a statement from my son describing, in detail, several incidents of confusion and erratic behavior that had not occurred, and it was notarized and submitted by my daughter-in-law. They were not just stealing from the company. They were building the legal architecture to erase me before anyone noticed the money was gone. "Tell me the timeline," I said. My old friend turned to his legal pad. "The company's annual review is Thursday morning. The outside auditors come in Thursday at 9. They have been preparing their report for 3 weeks, and based on what our forensic accountant found, the discrepancy in the vendor accounts will be visible and significant. If the guardianship petition were granted before Thursday, you would be legally incapacitated. You would have no standing to challenge any findings. Your son, as appointed guardian, would control all your assets, including your controlling interest in the company. He could direct the company's response to the audit. He could negotiate settlements, destroy records, and reassign liability." "The lock change this morning," I said, "was the acceleration," he confirmed. "They needed you removed from the property and established as a dependent before Thursday. The facility you were being sent to, Sunrise Gardens, has a memory care unit. Once you were checked in under a guardianship order, it would be very difficult for you to communicate with anyone outside." I looked at the window. Memphis, in late October. The oaks on Madison still holding their leaves, but barely. My wife had loved this time of year. She had this way of collecting fallen leaves and pressing them between the pages of books she had already read, not to preserve them, just because she thought beautiful things deserved a pause before they disappeared. I reached into my breast pocket and took out my daughter-in-law's letter. I read the underlined line again. A man who spent 40 years pulling wire through walls and crawl spaces had nothing to offer anyone anymore. I folded it. I put it back. "Tell me what we can do," I said. My old friend had been waiting for those words. He reached for the legal pad. He had already thought through most of it. That is what 45 years of friendship earns you. The man starts preparing your defense before you even know you need one. Phase 1, he said, was immediate. He had already drafted an emergency motion to the probate court to dismiss the guardianship petition on the grounds of fraudulent medical affidavits and conflict of interest. He had documentation of my recent physical and a statement from my actual physician of 12 years. The petition would be dead before it reached a judge's desk. Phase 2 was the fraud. He had already been in contact with the company's outside auditors, not to interfere with the audit but to expand its scope. They would now be looking specifically at Meridian Supply Solutions. The paper trail was, in his words, sloppy in the way that only truly arrogant people leave things sloppy. My daughter-in-law had been careful about the dollar amounts, but had reused the same invoice template repeatedly. Same font, same margins, same typographical error in the address field on every single document. The forensic accountant said it looked like she had downloaded one template and duplicated it 22 times over almost 2 years without ever thinking to vary the formatting. Phase 3, he said, and he paused here, the way he always pauses before the thing he wants me to think about carefully. Phase 3 is Thursday. The audit. You could let it proceed without your presence. You could let the auditors find what they find, let the legal process handle it, and remain here, away from the company, away from them. He stopped. Or, I said. Or, he said, you attend. He let that settle. The annual review is held in the company's main conference room. The executive team is required to be present. Your son will be there. His wife is not employed by the company, but she has attended as his guest at every annual event for the past 6 years. Based on the last email thread our IT team preserved before you asked them to, she plans to attend Thursday as well, positioned to monitor and manage any fallout. They do not know that you are the founder, I said. He shook his head. The company correspondence has always come through my firm. Your son knows his direct supervisor, the regional CEO who reports to the board. He has never met the board. He does not know who sits on it. He has your last name. It has simply never occurred to him that the man he calls every Sunday, the retired electrician who fixes his neighbor's porch lights and brings homemade cornbread to church potlucks, is the reason the building he works in exists. I said nothing for a moment. Then I asked him to book me a room at the Peabody. Not because I needed luxury, because I needed silence, and I needed a door that locked from the inside with a key only I controlled. He called ahead. They were expecting me. I will tell you something about the Peabody Hotel in Memphis. I wired half the renovation on the East Wing in 1994. I was on a crew of 8, and we worked 12-hour days for 6 weeks. And on the last day, the hotel manager brought us sandwiches and called us by our first names and shook every hand. I have never forgotten that. There is something about a place that remembers your labor even if it does not know your name. The doorman did not know my face, but he knew my reservation, and he used my name with the simple respect of someone doing their job well, and sometimes that is exactly what you need. I sat in the room and I called no one. I did not call my son. I did not call my daughter-in-law. I laid my wife's photograph, the one I keep in the inside pocket of every jacket I own, on the bedside table. It is from a fishing trip we took on the Hatchie River the summer before she got sick. She is laughing at something off camera, and her eyes are almost closed from the sun, and she is the most beautiful thing I have ever seen. I told her what had happened. I do this sometimes. It is not something I am embarrassed about. I said, I know you would tell me to be slow about this. I know you would say there is still a chance he does not know the worst of it. I know you would say that our son is not all bad, that no one is all bad, that the woman he married has a strong pull and a stronger will, and that he has always been the kind of man who follows the loudest voice in the room. I sat with that. I sat with it for a long time. Then I called my old friend and asked him to do one more thing. I asked him to send me the audio. He had told me there was audio. He had mentioned it briefly and I had not asked. Now I asked. He sent it an hour later. A file from a surveillance recording, legally obtained as part of the fraud investigation, taken from my son's company vehicle over a period of 2 weeks. My old friend had flagged a specific segment, 7 minutes. He warned me before I pressed play. He said, "I need you to hear this because you need to know who you are dealing with. But I also need you to know that I am sorry." I pressed play, my son's voice first. He sounded tense. He was driving. I could tell from the road noise. He said, "The auditors come Thursday. We have maybe 4 days to make sure the old man is handled." Then her voice. My daughter-in-law, unhurried. The voice of someone who has thought through every angle already and found them all satisfactory. She said, "The petition is filed. Once the court appoints you guardian, everything he owns rolls into the trust you control. The audit findings become your problem to manage, not a liability. You are the acting authority. You direct the company response." My son said, "And if he fights it?" She laughed. It was a quiet laugh, dismissive, the kind you use for something beneath your concern. She said, "Fight it with what? He is 67 years old. He lives alone. He has no idea what we have access to. He pulls wire for his neighbors for $20 and a handshake. What is he going to do?" Silence on the recording. Then my son said, "He is still my father." Her voice did not change in warmth or temperature because there was none to change. She said, "He is a liability. He has been a liability since the day you took that promotion. Every time a colleague asks about your family and you have to explain that your father is a retired electrician in a house in Whitehaven, I see the look on their faces. He embarrasses you. He embarrasses us. This is the clean version. He goes somewhere comfortable. You manage the legal exposure. And in 6 months, nobody thinks about it anymore." I stopped the recording. I sat in the silence of that hotel room with my wife's photograph on the nightstand, and I understood something that I had been refusing to understand for a long time. My son had not been led here against his will. My son had walked here. He had walked here step by step over years, choosing the voice in the room with the most confidence every single time. And eventually, that voice had convinced him that his father's quiet life was something to be managed and minimized rather than honored. The grief of that is something I cannot fully describe and will not try. What I will say is that when it passed, when the cold weight of it settled into something I could carry, I picked up the phone and called my old friend and told him to proceed with all 3 phases and to have me at the company Thursday morning at 9 o'clock sharp. He said, "Are you sure?" I said, "They think pulling wire for 40 years means I have nothing to offer. Let me show them what 40 years of work actually builds." He said, "I will have a car waiting." I said, "I know the address. I wired the building. I will find my own way in." Thursday morning I wore the suit I keep for occasions that require a man to be seen clearly. My wife bought it for me 12 years ago at a tailor on Beale Street. She had very specific ideas about how it should fit, and she stood there for 45 minutes telling the tailor exactly what adjustments to make, while I stood on the platform and pretended to look patient. It still fits. Some things you take care of, and they last. I arrived at 8:45. The lobby of the building was familiar in the way a piece of work is always familiar to the person who did it. I knew where every conduit ran behind every wall. I knew which panel served the conference room on the 14th floor. I knew the building the way a father knows the face of something he helped bring into the world. The receptionist did not know me. I gave her my name. She checked her list, and her expression shifted just slightly. The way people's expressions shift when a name they have heard discussed in a certain context suddenly appears in front of them in person. She picked up her phone and said something quietly. Within 90 seconds, the regional CEO came through the interior door himself. He is a man I hired 15 years ago, when he was a project engineer with good instincts and no ego about learning. He shook my hand with both of his and said, "Mr. Price, we are very glad you are here." The conference room was already full when we walked in. The outside auditors sat along one wall with their files and laptops. The company's CFO and general counsel were at the table. My old friend was there, his briefcase open, his face composed and unreadable in the way that means he is ready for anything. And at the far end of the table, in the chair that faced the door, my son sat in his best suit. His wife sat one chair to his right, her posture very straight, her expression arranged into something that was meant to project calm but was running a fraction too still, the way still water runs when something large is moving underneath it. My son saw me come through the door and his face did something I had never seen it do. It did not redden. It did not tighten. It simply stopped. Every expression cleared off it at once like a screen going dark. He was looking at me and he was looking at the regional CEO walking beside me and he was looking at the way the room had shifted when I entered, the way people who are accustomed to the actual structure of authority rearranged their attention, and some part of him was beginning to calculate what that meant and not arriving at any answer he was prepared for. My daughter-in-law recovered faster. She always recovered faster, she said, with a smile that I will give her was almost entirely convincing. What a surprise. What are you doing here? She glanced at the regional CEO. Is everything all right? The regional CEO did not answer her. He pulled out the chair at the head of the table, the one that had been left open, and he waited. I sat down. I looked at my son. He had gone pale in the way that people go pale when something physical is happening in their chest and their body is spending all available resources on managing it. I said, "Good morning." He said nothing. The regional CEO remained standing. He said, "For the record, I want to introduce the full room to the individual who has called this meeting. This is the founder and majority shareholder of this company. He has exercised his right as principal stakeholder to attend this year's annual review in person and to address a matter that has been referred to the board for action." The external auditors, who had been briefed that morning, did not react. The CFO did not react. My old friend opened a folder. My daughter-in-law's composure cracked. Not dramatically, just at the edges. A small, precise fracture around the eyes. She said, "Founder." She said the word, the way you say a word, when you are trying to make it mean something other than what it means. I looked at my son. I said, "I started this company in a second-hand van in 1987. Your mother packed me a lunch every morning for the first 3 years because we could not afford to buy it. You were 6 years old when I landed the first commercial contract. You used to ride with me on weekends to the job sites and hand me tools because you said you wanted to learn. I never told you what it grew into because your mother asked me not to. She was afraid of what money does to people. She was afraid it would change us. She was right about a great many things." My son's hands were flat on the table. He was not looking at his wife. He was not looking at the room. He was looking at me with the expression of a man watching a structure he built, his entire understanding of the world on reveal that its foundation was something he had never examined. I said, "I have spent 40 years building this so that it would be here for you. Not to hand to you, because she did not want that either. She wanted you to earn something for yourself, but she wanted you to have a foundation." I kept quiet about it because I honored her wish. I kept quiet about it for so long that someone in this room decided that my silence was weakness. Decided that a man who worked with his hands had nothing behind those hands worth fearing. I looked at my daughter-in-law then. She held my gaze. I will give her that too. She was not the kind of person who looked away. I said, "Meridian Supply Solutions, LLC. 22 invoices over 22 months. $2,940,000 billed to this company for services and materials that were never provided by a vendor that exists on paper only. Registered in your name. Approved, in every single instance, by my son." She said nothing. The lead auditor opened his file. He began to read. I did not need to listen to the details because I already knew them. I watched my son's face instead. I watched him listen to the numbers and the invoice numbers and the dates and the routing accounts, and with each one I watched something go out of him slowly, the way air goes out of something that has been carrying too much pressure for too long. When the auditor finished, my old friend stood and addressed the room. He noted the emergency motion that had been filed with the probate court that morning and the documentation that had been submitted demonstrating the fraudulent basis of the guardianship petition. He noted that the court had already issued a summary dismissal. He noted that copies of all relevant materials had been forwarded to the Shelby County District Attorney's Office and to the FBI field office, given the interstate nature of the wire transfers. My daughter-in-law said, "This is a misunderstanding." Her voice was still composed. I watched her and I thought, she will hold this composure for a long time. She is that kind of person. She will hold it until there is nothing left to hold. My old friend did not argue with her. He simply set a document on the table in front of her and said, "This is a copy of what has been submitted to the DA. You will want to speak with your attorney." She looked at the document. She looked at my son. My son was not looking at her. I stood. I said to my son, "I know she was a strong pull. I know she has been a strong pull for a long time. I know that when someone tells you over and over that where you come from is something to be ashamed of, eventually you start to hear it even when they are not speaking. I know that. I am not standing here pretending that what happened to you is simple or that your part in it is something that goes away easily." He looked up at me. His eyes were wet. He was 52 years old and he looked very young in that moment. The way people look young when they are confronting something true about themselves for the first time. I said, "But you approved those invoices. You knew. And you signed your name to a petition that said I was mentally incompetent. You signed your name to lies about your own father. And before you tell me she pushed you into it, I need you to understand that I heard the recording from your car. I heard you say, 'He is still my father.' And then I heard you keep going." The room was very quiet. I said, "That will be something you carry. I cannot carry it for you." I picked up my suit jacket from the back of the chair. 2 men from the regional security team were waiting in the corridor outside with a detective from the financial crimes unit. It was handled quietly, the way my old friend had arranged it. No cameras, no audience beyond the conference room. My daughter-in-law walked out into the corridor with her attorney's number already dialed. She did not look at me as she passed. My son walked out behind her. At the threshold, he stopped. He turned. He looked at me. He started to speak and stopped. He tried again and stopped again. Then he said, "I did not know you built this." I said, "I know." He said, "I am sorry, Dad." I said, "I know that too." The detective stepped forward and I walked back into the conference room and closed the door and sat down with the regional CEO and the auditors and my old friend and began the work of understanding exactly what had been taken and how to account for it. My phone, which I had turned to silent, showed me the count when I checked it 4 hours later in the parking garage. 41 missed calls from my daughter-in-law's number, all in the first hour. Then nothing. Her attorney had told her to stop calling. I sat in my truck for a while. The October afternoon was doing what October afternoons do in Memphis, the light going sideways and gold. Everything it touches looking briefly like it is worth more than it is. I took my wife's photograph out of my jacket pocket. I looked at her by the river, with her eyes squinted and her head back laughing. I said, "I kept your house. I kept the company. I kept the name clean." The last part was not entirely true yet. There was still the legal process, the audit findings, the attorneys, the long procedural work of accountability. My son would face consequences. My daughter-in-law would face more. That would take time, and I was prepared for the time. But the foundation was intact. The work I had started with a second-hand van and a packed lunch was still standing. And the people who had tried to convince themselves that it was nothing had found out what 40 years of quiet, honest labor actually builds. It builds something that does not fall when they come for it. Before you tell me where you are watching from, I want to say this. If you are a parent who has given everything to someone who told you it was not enough, hear me. Your work is not nothing because someone decided it was beneath them to acknowledge it. The electrician, the mail carrier, the janitor, the teacher, the man who fixed his neighbor's porch lights on a Saturday morning because someone needed it done. These are not small lives. These are the lives that hold everything else up. The people who look down on that work have never stopped to consider what goes dark when it stops. I am 67 years old and I am still standing. They said my place was at the end of the road. in a room somewhere where I could be forgotten. They were wrong about what I built. They were wrong about what I am. And they were wrong about where I was going. Now tell me, where are you watching from? Drop your city in the comments, hit like if you believe that quiet men build lasting things, and subscribe because I will see you in the next one.